evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I'm the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Chief with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. Our office investigates complaints of civil rights discrimination, combats human trafficking around the region, ensures all people can access county government services in the language of their preference, and provides opportunities for learning and engagement on issues of social justice importance. With me tonight as co-hosts are Tiana Davis, also with the Office of Human Rights, and Dr. Audrey Lau, who is the Adult and Senior Services Specialist with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, our partners for this and many other of our events. On behalf of the Office of Human Rights and the library system, it is our honor to welcome Natasha Lester in conversation about her new book, The Mademoiselle Alliance. Natasha Lester is the New York Times best-selling author of The Paris Seamstress, The Paris Orphan, The Paris Secret, and The Mademoiselle Alliance, and a former marketing executive for L'Oreal. Her novels have won several awards, been international bestsellers, and are translated into 21 different languages and published all around the world. When she's not writing, she loves collecting vintage fashion, practicing the art of fashion illustration, and traveling the world. She lives with her husband and 3 children in Perth, Western Australia, from where she joins us today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be here.
To get us started tonight, could you take a few minutes and just tell our viewers a bit about the book?
Of course. So the Mademoiselle Alliance is about a woman named Marie-Madeleine Fourcade. She was a rally car driver. She was a pilot. She was a journalist. She was a mother of 2 children. She was destined to become a concert pianist, but instead the Second World War happened and she became the only woman to lead a French resistance network during the Second World War. And not only that, she led the largest resistance network, a network named Alliance that provided the Allies with some of the most vital intelligence, which led to things like the D-Day invasion of Europe. So it's pretty extraordinary what she was able to do in this very patriarchal time in history. 1940s France was a world ruled by men. And here was this 31-year-old woman who stepped into a leadership position in a resistance network in charge of senior military men decades older than she was. So it was this once in a lifetime extraordinary moment. And I always say that to fully appreciate and understand how it was that a woman was able to do that, you kind of have to go back to her childhood and her upbringing, because that's really where she was formed into this adventurous woman who stood up for what she believed in. So the book traverses some of her earlier life as well as her wartime life to really illustrate the kind of woman that Marie-Madeleine Fourcade was. So she was actually a French woman born in Marseille, but she grew up in Shanghai. And her father worked for this merchant kind of marine service, and it was normal back in those days for the wife and the children to remain behind in France, because in those times Shanghai was perceived to be sort of an uncivilized place. But her mother was an adventuress. She took the 3 children to Shanghai in the 1910s and didn't keep them locked away in the French concession of Shanghai. She let them roam the city really freely, so long as they were in company with their nanny. And so Marie-Madeleine talks to her, the one biographer who spoke to her when she was still alive, and she could still describe the smells of Shanghai, the sights, the vibrant, cosmopolitan, very unusual city that she grew up in, and made this really deep impression on her. And then sadly her father died when she was in her teens, so the family moved back to Paris. And this whole time Marie-Madeleine has been playing the piano for 8 hours a day. She has this dream of being a concert pianist. She is accepted into a music conservatory in Paris, and I think she found bourgeois Parisian life a little bit dull after growing up somewhere like Shanghai. And so across a crowded room one night, she locked eyes with this tall, handsome stranger and fell instantly and very impulsively in love. Sure, she was in love with him, but I also feel like she loved the fact that he was about to be posted to Morocco. And for someone who'd grown up in Shanghai, Morocco seemed like the next logical place to live out the next phase of her life. So at age 18, after knowing this man for just a few weeks, she moves to Shanghai as his wife. And again, this is so emblematic of the kind of person she was. One of the first things she does when she gets to Morocco is to learn the Arabic language, which for a woman in the 1920s, is a white woman in the 1920s, is pretty unusual.
Mhm.
She just, everywhere she went, she wanted to be able to speak to the local people, and she wanted to immerse herself in whatever was going on in that world. So she also volunteered at a local women's clinic, helped women deliver their babies, and then started riding out with her husband on camelback and horseback to visit the local tribes. So he was a military intelligence officer. Morocco is a French protectorate at this time, so he was basically there to spy on the locals, I suppose you could say. And Marie-Madeleine goes out with him, and she can speak the language, so she kind of as his translator when he's talking to the local people, and gets probably a little bit of an early taste of intelligence work doing that. And now, as you might have guessed from this description of her thus far, she was very sociable, very
Mhm.
outgoing. Had a very spirited nature, had lots of friends, loved music and dancing. Her husband was the exact opposite. He was not very sociable. He loved nothing more than just to stay at home. So they were quite incompatible, and they decided to separate, sadly, in the early 1930s. So Marie-Madeleine took her two children back with her to France, and that was a pretty scandalous thing for a woman to do at that time. So again, this shows the level of bravery she had within her in terms of facing society's expectations of what she should do as a woman. And I think she thought, well, if you're going to gossip about me anyway, then I'm going to go all out to really make you talk about me.
Yeah.
So she becomes a rally car driver, as you do when you return to Paris
Right.
in the 1930s.
Yeah.
Because, car rallying's really big at this time. There's lots of these pan-European and pan-France car rallies. She's got a little Citroën. So she's behind the wheel of her little car, careening down the mountain passes, gets pretty good at car rallying. She places in a few rallies. Now, that would be enough thrills and spills for most people, but not for the intrepid Marie-Madeleine. She also gets her pilot's license and learns to fly aeroplanes. And of course, this whole time, she is raising her two children and working as a journalist. I always say that I feel like I need to go out and get a few more hobbies, because
Right.
compared
Right.
to Marie-Madeleine, I do not have enough going on in my life. And this is all before the war. And the reason I wanted to tell that story is that part of it is in the book, in the Mademoiselle Alliance, but it just shows how much she was willing to throw herself into life, how curious she was, how much she loved to try something new. So this is partly what the book is about, this early part of her life, and then we move into her wartime life.
Mhm. Well, well, there's so much I want to talk about with her. Well, one of the things I was thinking about is this car. I mean, this car, the car racing part, and like as you were talking, I was like, I think you kind of got there, but like, did you find yourself as you were researching her, reading about this, like how fast were you driving as you were doing this? Like, does it? Because I felt like a contagion factor. In all seriousness, from reading this about wanting to be more spirited, wanting to be a braver and more fierce version of myself. So,
Absolutely. And I think for me, that was the one thing that drove the writing of the book. And the one thing that I hope people do take away from it is this idea that, we're so often told to hope for a better future, but hope's a really passive thing. If you just sort of sit around and hope, nothing will ever change. Whereas Marie-Madeleine, even though she had no formal training in the military, no formal training in intelligence, she knew that she had to take action to fight for that better future that she hoped would arrive, because otherwise it wouldn't come to her. And so she was this ordinary woman, just like you or I. She didn't have any of this kind of training that she needed. She made up resistance on the run. But she did that. She threw herself into that so she could get this better future that she wanted for herself, for her children, for her country. And she shows us all what an ordinary woman can do to change the world if she puts her mind to it. So that is exactly what Marie-Madeleine Fourcade means to me. And that was what drove the writing of the book.
I mean, and that is so incredible. I wish I captured your exact quote because I gotta have to pull it out. But this thing that hope is a bit passive, and to
Yeah.
take the next thing. I mean, I just want to ask you one more thing just about the introduction, and I'll hand it over to Audrey and Tiana. But one of the things you mentioned this in your introduction, just about her time in Morocco and acting as a translator and an interviewer, kind of on behalf of her spouse. And as I was reading, there's a quote that you have her think, okay, and the quote is, "I catch myself sometimes making the colonized a fable, treating their culture like a curiosity." And I read that and I was like, well, okay, so we are 80 years after this book is supposed to take place. And like, that is just such a timely message. And one of the themes of this book that I really, really appreciated. So I was just wondering if you want to talk about, I mean, I think there's a long conversation about how you fictionalize a character, but maybe we could just talk about this part, like building in something like that, which is so relevant for today and also Morocco then.
Yeah, and it's the one thing I always say, the genre I write in is called historical fiction, but in every single historical novel that I've written, there are so many contemporary resonances. And I think that's the thing about historical fiction. In some ways, it shows us how far we've come, but in other ways, it shows us how far we still have to go, because there are still many places throughout the world where people are colonized and they're being ruled by people that they wouldn't necessarily choose to be ruled by. And that is a common thing throughout history. And everybody says, oh, we learn from history, we will never want that to happen again. But it's amazing how often we can feel ourselves on the brink of things that we said should never happen again, actually potentially happening again. And I feel like, I didn't realize when I was writing the book kind of where the world was going. And resonances like back in 1936, when Marie-Madeleine first gets recruited to work so she gets recruited to work on a newspaper which is supposed to be trying to show the French government and the French people what Hitler and the Nazis are up to in Germany. Because in 1936, most people in Europe thought Hitler was a comical man. They thought he was kind of funny and kind of odd, and didn't didn't have any expectations of the reach of his ambitions and his ability to make those ambitions become realities. And you can see how it is that people can badly misjudge and not understand what some people will do for power. And I feel like, those resonances with contemporary life, I didn't quite realize were going to be so strong when the book actually came out. So to me, it is historical fiction, but it's kind of not. In some ways, it's a cautionary tale, and in some ways, it's an inspiring tale because it shows us, what we can do when we want to achieve something different to the world that we find ourselves living in.
I think that's a great point. This idea of like, how are we going to meet whatever historical moment we are in? Because all of us
Yes.
all of us are fortunate enough to live in a historical moment, whatever it may be.
Yes.
And how are you going to meet it? And so I love that. Thank you.
I did have a question about how you go about writing a fictional telling of a real person's life. So a lot of what was in there, these are the things that happened throughout Marie-Madeleine's life. But so how did you fill in the blanks there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I often say that, a non-fiction writer will tell you, if they're writing about something like Buckingham Palace, for example, they'll tell you how big the palace is, how many rooms it has, what it's constructed out of, how long it took to be built. But the novelist will tell you what it felt like to be the man who put the very last brick into the palace and who stood back and was like, wow, I just finished the palace. That's literally fit for a queen. So we're channeling inside the people who were experiencing those events and trying to imagine how they might have felt and putting those kinds of emotions and thoughts and feelings onto the page so that people understand that history isn't just events. History is people. It's the things that people did and the way that they felt, which drove them to behave in a certain way. So when I'm approaching something like this. In fact, the hardest part with writing this as a novel was that so many of the most unbelievable moments in Marie-Madeleine's life are actually real. And so I had to write this quite extensive author's note at the back so that people would understand that the way in which she was prepared to put her body on the line was true. I was not making up or exaggerating the extent to which she was willing to risk her life to fight for freedom for her country and for her family and her people. So that was one thing I was really conscious of, trying to make those more extraordinary, out there, mind-blowing moments feel real, but also just grappling with the sheer quantity of information. She was running a resistance network peopled by 3,000 agents at its peak. So you've got potentially a cast of 3,000 characters, and no novelist can ever write a book with 3,000 people in it because nobody will read it. It's just too many characters. And also, they had real names and code names. So that's 6,000 names alone that you're trying to manage up front. And just as an aside, while I'm talking about code names, another thing I love about Marie-Madeleine Fourcade is that while all the men in her network took on, so they all had animal code names. The Nazis called them Noah's Ark because all they knew about this network was that they had these animal code names. And so the men in the network took on names, of the, brave, bold animals like wolf and eagle. And Marie-Madeleine is the hedgehog, which again, I love because she says the hedgehog is a creature that nobody thinks much of. It just kind of scuttles around under the undergrowth. Nobody pays it any attention, but if it's threatened, it can roll itself up into a ball and give you one hell of a sting. So again, that really reflects the kind of person that she was. So what I ended up having to do was to fully flesh out how Marie-Madeleine might have felt in some of those more terrifying experiences that she went through and some of those more tragic experiences that she went through. To give space to those, you have to consolidate in other areas. So that means taking this large cast of characters and selecting some of the agents who you're going to focus on, potentially combining 3 or 4 real people into one composite character. They were on the run from the Nazis constantly, so they moved their headquarters 60 or 70 times during the course of the war. Again, that's too many different French locations for people to keep track of. No one's French geography is that good, and all the places have got strange names. So again, you whittle that down and select just some of those headquarters so that people can keep track of where they're at any one time in the book. So those are the kinds of decisions you're weighing up. Whittling down the logistics to give space to the broader feelings and emotions and experiences that Marie-Madeleine and her agents had during the course of the war.
Okay.
I was going to ask you how you dealt with the fact that the Maquis, the Alliance, like all these French resistance groups have not really had a day in the sun. And, a lot of Americans think that, well, we all know the Americans think that they walked in 1945 and saved everybody's.
As a Canadian, I'd like to have a few words about that.
Right. What I'm saying is the French dealt with Hitler for the better part of 4 or 5 years before we ever showed up. And so like these people, not you, like you talk about, they used their bodies, they did everything in there. I mean, and you're really feeling it in 1944, 1943. Like you were like, my God, when is someone going to show up? And so I guess my question to you is, how did you do with the fact that the French really haven't, it's taken them a long time to acknowledge that, the people who resisted were actually the patriots, and the people who rolled over were really the traitors. And like, how did you find yourself? Because I get so frustrated when I read this period, because it's like the French are like, oh, I guess we're gonna finally give her this award. And like Leon Fay does not even have a Wikipedia page. Like I mean, he does, it's in French, but like, these are major players in these groups, and they have, you have given them sunshine. And I was curious how when you were researching, how you felt with that.
Yeah, that's another really good question. And to some extent, I understand partly I mean, immediately after the war, the French people as a whole were so ashamed of what they had done, because really they, with the armistice in 1940, they handed over the country to Hitler, and they were deeply ashamed of all of the collaboration that had gone on, and how complicit they were in so many atrocities. So their natural human response was to forget, to put it totally in the past, and to not think about, talk about, consider the war ever again. But what that means is that for a network like Alliance, Marie-Madeleine's network is, out of those 3,000 agents, 439 of them died during the war. They were captured by the Nazis and imprisoned and tortured and killed. But I bet that nobody anymore knows the names of those 439 people. And that to me is heartbreaking, because those people gave up their lives for the freedoms that we all enjoy today. And to be so unremembered is, like I say, it's heartbreaking. And the thing that gives me the most rage, and what I do with that rage as I channel it into the writing of the book, is that so I went to visit Marie-Madeleine's grave in the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris. I always go and visit the places where my characters lived, because it gives me a real sense of what they could see, their perspectives, authentically helps me to be able to write about those locations. And so the Père Lachaise Cemetery is a really famous tourist attraction, because people like Jim Morrison from The Doors, Edith Piaf, Oscar Wilde are buried there. It's such a big tourist attraction that it has an information office, and the office, you can get a map. And on that map is marked the locations of the graves of all the famous people buried at the cemetery. Now, do you think that the one woman to lead a resistance network in France during the Second World War is considered famous enough to be on that map of the graves of famous people? No, she isn't. So all I knew was that her grave was in Division 84 of the cemetery. Now, if you've ever been to the cemetery, it's enormous. Division 84 is also enormous. It's got roads and streets running through it. So I was hunting down this one grave, and I finally stumbled upon it, and it's a family tomb. So on the tomb, you can read the names of Marie-Madeleine's parents. You can read the name of her second husband from after the war. And then there's this blank space on the grave. And I kind of bent over this blank space and realized that actually there were the very faint traces of some letters there. Once upon a time, a name had been engraved in this blank space, but time and weather had conspired together to erase this name from the grave almost entirely. And then I realized that that was where Marie-Madeleine Fourcade's name was engraved. So she had been erased from her own tombstone. And standing there looking at that made me remember what Charles de Gaulle did during the war and after the war, which was to create the Compagnon de la Libération, which was an honor he bestowed upon the people he believed had fought the hardest and the most valiantly for France's freedom during the war. He bestowed that honor upon 1,038 people in total. 1,032 of them were men. So he believed that only 6 women in the whole of France had fought valiantly for France's freedom during the war. None of those 6 women were Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, despite leading the largest resistance network in France, but 3 of her male subordinates were on that list. So 3 men that she was giving orders to, that she was directing, who were doing what they were doing because she was, in charge and making those things happen. And standing there at the gravesite, that was all I could think of, because it was like this horrible metaphor for how a woman gets erased from history. And it really made me think, gosh, what have you got to do as a woman to be remembered by history? If what she did was not enough. So yes, to your question, it makes me equal parts sad and equal parts enraged at how easily people do get forgotten and how unjust and unfair that is. And, as historical novelists, we're often trying to resurrect these people from the past who we believe should be more widely known. And it's the best thing in the world to me when a reader emails me and says, I read your book and I wanted to find out more about this person because I was so inspired. So I went and ordered this other biography, or I spent some time searching the internet, and that you've sparked their curiosity to do wider research. into this person and they're starting to spread the word. That's your goal, ultimate goal as a writer.
Well, oh, go ahead, Audrey.
No, I was just going to say, I've read a lot, and as the historian of the group, I was very pleased that this was not a romanticized, like, historical fiction. I hate like romanticized World War II, because I feel like there's so many authors who take, create events, create tragedy amongst. There's already plenty of tragedy. There's great stories out there. But I really just want to say thank you, because one of the things I think you do brilliantly is you give her like this romance with Leon that we don't really see in the historical record. We know it, we know they had a child, we know they were together, but like you give her something that I feel like emboldens her even more, like on her return. And I thought that was really brilliant. And for those of you out there who are like, I don't want to read fiction, this book was definitely not one of those. This was one of those books where I've read the history, and this was just a brilliant companion. And I want people to know that. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you, Audrey. That's such a lovely thing for you to say. I really appreciate that.
I was going to say that you've achieved your goal, because I'm like Audrey, because Audrey, has read several books on Marie-Madeleine, and I was one of the people who I didn't know anything about her, the story, and I went and Googled and went down the rabbit holes, and so and want to learn more, and so you have done that. I mean, I can tell you from me, I mean, it's incredible. And I'm so glad we're at this part, because I pulled out another quote in part 5. You open part 5 with a quote that you've translated from her. And it's about the men and women who resisted Nazi domination. And of them, she writes, "Soon nobody will know what they did, nor why they did it, nor whether it was necessary to do it. You may even pity them for dying for nothing. I want to know that they will not be forgotten, and above all, that you understand the divine flame that burned in their hearts." So, like, first of all, what a powerful, powerful quote. And I was so moved to read it in the book. And I was thinking, and I'm glad we're talking about this, because, through her words and your words, these people are not forgotten. And I realize that's not strictly true. You've just acknowledged that those names are many of those names and those people and their stories are gone. But I was thinking about why it's so important to capture these, and not only to honor the people who've gone before, but I'm thinking, for us also to recognize now the people who are toiling away in ways that we do not know, in places that we do not know, continuing to fight against oppression and injustice. And I think, you mentioned before the reason how this is an inspirational story. And again, I think it goes back to a story for our times as we face uncertainty. Like, I don't know if we can just talk a little bit about, I mean, maybe there's 2 questions, because I was also thinking, and I think you touched on this in your opening remarks too, that like, you didn't necessarily predict when you were writing this, the moment in time in which we would be reading this book. But, to me, reading that in this time really brought home the importance of not forgetting historical people, but also being attentive in a really open way to the people who are doing this kind of work right now.
Yes. Yeah. And that was another thing that I really admired Marie-Madeleine Fourcade for, because she recognized the people in her network who were the people who were most likely to be forgotten. So, for instance, there's a moment in her memoir where she talks about one of her agents, a woman called B, and Marie-Madeleine has just come to her new headquarters in the south of France, in a place called Le Lavendu, which was a cottage owned by B. And B has made dinner for Marie-Madeleine and the agents in their new headquarters. And Marie-Madeleine takes this moment to think, these women who are the ones putting food on the table, well, working for the network, are just as important as the ones who are out there, risking their lives to gather the intelligence, because if people haven't been fed, they can't go out there and collect that intelligence. So to her every person in the network. It didn't matter what they were doing, whether they were just putting the food on the table or whether they were, caring for one of her agent's children so that the agent could do their work, or whether they were out there, running across the border. All of those, you needed everyone to do all of those pieces of work for that network as a whole to continue to exist. And she saw the network as a family, and she knew the names of her agents' children and their grandparents. And she would, the silk stockings and the cosmetics that MI6 would send her, she would give to her agents so that they would feel like they were a part of something. And I don't know whether that's because she was a female leader or if it's just because of the kind of person that she was, but the way she acknowledged every single person and loved every single person in her network was so deep. And that's why that particular quote that you read out resonated with me so much, because she wasn't just talking about, kind of nameless people that she had never met who sort of joined the network. She was talking about people that she knew deeply and she knew intimately and that she cared for. And I love that after the war, what she dedicated her life to was to fighting for recognition for people who worked as resistance agents during the war, because France was in this period of trying to forget. She saw the danger of that. She had families whose father had died or whose husband had died, and those families needed to be looked after. So there was this very long, rigorous bureaucratic process of paperwork that a family had to fill out to get compensation if someone working for the resistance had died, and it was normally the person who was the breadwinner for the household. So she helped the families to do that. She helped her agents to fill out a different set of paperwork to be acknowledged as having worked for the resistance during the war. And she advocated tirelessly for remembering these people and making sure that they were marked and memorialized. And she had these annual picnics where all of the agents and the families of the agents would come together at a certain place in France and not just enjoy the freedom, not just reminisce about the past and what they'd done in the war, but be together to enjoy the freedom that they had fought so hard for. And I think that's such a beautiful thing, that was what she gave her life to after the war, this idea of trying to make people remember. And of course, you can't always be 100% successful in that, as she acknowledges in that quote.
Well, I think you did a wonderful job throughout the book of showing her care, and the genuine and the relationships and the care for and between the people with which she worked. I'm going to hand it back to Audrey and Tana in just a moment, but we do have a question from a viewer. Dr. Stewart is wondering, with all the books that you've written, who is your favorite character and which one do you personally most resemble?
Look, I don't think I have ever written a woman more extraordinary than Marie-Madeleine Fourcade. So she's absolutely my favorite character. In fact, I feel like I won't ever be able to write another book set in the Second World War, because I don't think I would ever find anyone else's story who would quite measure up to the one that I've written in the Mademoiselle Alliance. But in terms of who I personally most resemble, I suppose the thing when you're writing a book like this is that you continually hope that you might be able to, if you were ever confronted with the same set of circumstances, that you might be able to step up and in a way that Marie-Madeleine Fourcade did, but you never really know. And for me, there was one moment in the book where I thought, I don't know whether I could have done that. And that's when she smuggles herself to Madrid in a mail bag. And so I'll just talk a little bit about that, because that's the one moment where I was writing, I'm thinking, I don't know whether I had the internal fortitude to do that. So the Alliance Network was actually created and started by a man named Navarre, and Marie-Madeleine was initially his chief of staff. He was arrested in late 1941, and everyone kind of looked around as to what would happen. Would the network just crumble, or would someone else take over? And because Marie-Madeleine was his chief of staff and knew all of the agents, she kind of stepped into the role. But she was only 31 years old. She was a woman. She didn't have any military training. So she knew there were plenty of doubters in the network who weren't sure whether this young blonde woman would be able to be the network leader. So she was trying to prove herself to her agents and to herself, I believe, actually. But then quite soon after, her headquarters was raided and the police took all of the radios that MI6 had given them to communicate all of the intelligence they were gathering back to London. And they took all the money that MI6 had given her to pay her agents. And that's a big problem because without money, you can't pay your agents, they can't feed their families, they're unlikely to stay around. Without radios, you're collecting all of this intelligence, but you can't pass it back to the Allies. So she has to get in touch with MI6 to say, send me more radios, send me more money. But she can't just pick up the telephone and say, hey, operator, put me through to MI6 in London, because she's living in occupied France. So she's trying to figure out a way to get in touch with MI6. And just the fact that she thought this was possible, again, goes to the kind of woman that she was. So the solution she came up with is that if she got herself to Spain, she would be able to go to the British embassy in Spain and they would be able to call MI6. Spain's a neutral country during the Second World War, but she's got to get across the border and she doesn't have any travel papers. No one is going to let her go across the border because she's a wanted woman. So she calls one of her agents in, and this agent has this job couriering the diplomatic mailbag between the Vichy French government, which was the collaborationist French government that was set up at the time, to the French embassy in Spain. So he's got Marie-Madeleine Citron that she used to rally in, and he's taking this diplomatic mailbag back and forth. Now, of course, the Vichy French government don't know he's working for the resistance. And of course, he's reading all the correspondence in the diplomatic mailbag every time it takes it back and forth, and they're passing that on to MI6. Anyway, Marie-Madeleine calls him in and says, tell me how big the diplomatic mailbag is. And he says, oh, ordinary mailbag size, 4 feet by 2 feet. Why? And she says to him, because I'm going to have to hide in that mailbag and you're going to have to drive me over the border to the British embassy in Spain. And he says, well, you know, you're mad because you're 5'7", and just let me repeat, the diplomatic mailbag is 4 feet by 2 feet. Like, the math doesn't compute. You will not fit in the bag. And she says, well, I'm just going to have to try. So she's trying to cram herself into the bag and she just doesn't fit, obviously. It's, you know, almost mathematically impossible. But then her agent says to her, oh, actually, when I was a kid, I went to the circus and I saw a contortionist fit himself into a bag of a similar size. You know, this is what he did. And he demonstrates this like deep full squat where your butt's practically on the ground and your whole upper torso is folded over your shins and your head is tucked into your ankles, basically. This excruciatingly uncomfortable position for most normal people. Marie-Madeleine is not a contortionist, I should also add. So it's difficult to just get her body into that position. And also she suffers from something called hip dysplasia. So she's got a very painful hip just in normal everyday circumstances, let alone doubling herself over and cramming herself into a mailbag. But she manages to get her body into this position in the bag, and it's really painful. Her hip is, you know, incredibly sore. And they're trying to get the bag closed because she's in the bag, but they just can't. They need like a 1/2 inch, and it's so close, it's almost heartbreaking. And they're like, surely we've got to be able to just get another 1/2 inch. And they're trying to push her down a little bit more, but she just will not fit. And so she realizes the thing that is taking up the room in the bag is her dress. So she gets out of the bag, takes off her dress, gets back in the bag in her underwear, and now finally the bag closes. So she thinks she's going to have to stay in the bag for 2 hours because it's December, it's winter, just to add another complicating factor into the whole scenario. So the road over the Pyrenees from France into Spain is closed. You've got to put your car onto a train because the road is too snowy and too icy, and the train goes through a tunnel that connects France to Spain, and that train journey takes 2 hours. So she thinks she's going to be in the mailbag for that 2-hour train journey. And she's thinking, okay, 120 minutes, this is incredibly painful. And I also can't breathe, but I can put up with this for 120 minutes. So they drive to a forest just near the train station on the French side of the border. Her agent puts her in the bag, puts the bag onto the back seat of the car, piles up 4 car tires around it because he's got to disguise the shape of the bag. It doesn't just have diplomatic correspondence in it, it's got a full-grown woman inside it, so it looks kind of odd. He drives into the station, and the station master comes out and says to him, "Oh, bad news. The train arrived early today. It's already left. You'll have to wait for the next train." And her agent is panic stricken and he says, "How long is it until the next train arrives?" And the station master says, "Oh, it won't be here for 8 hours." And it's not like Marie-Madeleine can just pop out of the bag and say, "Oh, surprise, I was hiding in here," because then the station master is going to know that someone is trying to smuggle themselves across the border. So she now knows she's got to stay in the bag for the 8 hours it takes for the train to get there, plus the 2 hours it takes to get through the tunnel. 10 hours in total. No food, no water. She's in incredible pain, can't breathe. She's freezing cold because it's December and it's winter. And that was the moment, writing that book, where I thought, I don't know whether I could have done that, because that sounds like absolute torture. And amazingly, though, and again, this just goes to the fact of the kind of woman that she survives that experience, and she doesn't, pop out of the bag and give everybody away and get herself and her agent arrested. She makes it through. When her agent opens the bag on the Spanish side of the border, he's terrified. He thinks he's going to have to go back to France and tell the whole network that he's killed the leader. She's unconscious, of course, but she is alive. And so he revives her with a slug of cognac, as you do when you're in France. And then he takes her into the British embassy in Spain, and she can't walk because her muscles are so cramped from being in that extraordinary position for such a long period of time. So he's got to carry her in. And so her arrival at the British embassy is this big shock because, of course, she hasn't been able to telephone ahead to say that she's coming. And not only that, she's been carried in by a man, but also up until that point, all that the British knew about the leader of the Alliance network was that their code name was POZ 55. And so what did they assume about POZ 55? They all assumed that POZ 55 was a man. And suddenly it's like, oh, surprise, I'm a woman. So yeah, remarkable woman, remarkable story. I would love to feel like I had that kind of internal resilience and fortitude. But boy, I don't know. I guess you don't know until someone tells you need to stuff yourself inside a mailbag. Let's hope that never happens to any of us.
I was wondering if you could talk more about something that Marie-Madeleine said. It was something to the effect of, "I can't and I won't choose my children over France." And I feel like even today, a mom who doesn't make her whole life revolve around her children is shamed. So what was that like for her in, the 40s?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. So she doesn't talk about her children a lot in her memoir, which I think is pretty normal for a woman of that time, having done a lot of research into women at that time, particularly if they're in some kind of leadership role. The view is that they don't want to talk about these vulnerabilities because then people do judge them as a woman. They just want to be seen as a person, and have their actions represent the kind of person they are, not necessarily be judged for their gender. So she doesn't mention them a lot. And for me, as a novelist, I have to look out for the moments where she does mention them, because that to me is where the significance lies. And there's this one moment when the Nazis put her children on their most wanted list in 1943 in an attempt to flush out Marie-Madeleine Fourcade. And obviously that was devastating for her because she'd been trying to keep her children safe until that moment by having her mother look after them. She then put her son into a boarding school in Toulouse, which was run by a Jesuit priest who had worked for the resistance in World War One. So he kind of knew how to keep someone safe. So she'd been trying all of these ways to keep her children safe, but to keep them in France near her, because she couldn't see them a lot, but she could occasionally just visit them if she felt that things were safe enough to be able to do that. But you know, when the Nazis put your kids on their most wanted list, she knew that from that moment on, her children could not stay in France, because if she did let them stay in France, she was basically signing their death warrant. So she had to get them out of France. And, you know, we all know that Paris was liberated in August 1944, but this was early 1943. 1943 was a terrible year for the resistance, and she has no idea how much longer the war is going to go on for. Is it going to go on for 1 more year, 2 more years, 5 more years, 10 more years? Is it going to go on for the rest of her life? That's kind of how it felt for her at that moment. So she's got to send her children out of France, not knowing when she's going to be able to see them again. And she writes in her memoir, I felt as if I was being buried alive. And again, like I say, she doesn't mention her children and how she felt about them very often. But that one sentence was so striking to me, because it showed that even she, who was trying to leave out these mentions of her children and her feelings, couldn't leave it out at that moment. It was so significant and so impactful on her. So those were the kinds of things that, when I was building this woman who I believed was struggling with the decisions about caring for her children, caring for her agents, trying to fight for her country's freedom, trying to juggle all of these seemingly incompatible goals, those are the moments I really dug into as a writer and tried to explore and extrapolate and build in as part of her character. So that's kind of, you know, what you're always looking for when you're writing those scenes. And it's really interesting to me. There was a biography about Marie-Madeleine that Lynn Olson wrote and was published in 2019, called Madame Fourcade's Secret War, which, if people want a nonfiction source, it's a really accessible, fantastic biography. And I noticed that some people, in reviewing that book on places like Goodreads, were you know, really negative about the way in which Marie-Madeleine had left her children during the war, and, you know, sent them away to others to care for. And they felt that a mother's job was to be with her children. And, you know, to judge a woman who is trying to save her country and to stop all of her people from being thrown into jail and from having all of their rights stripped back and taken away from them, like, I just found that really shocking that people would be so judgmental. But people are, as you say, you know, people believe that a mother's place is with their children. So I believe she would have been very much where, particularly in the 1940s, that was exactly where the mother was meant to be, with her children, of all of those ways in which she was behaving outside the norm and the judgments people will be placing on her then, and that they would continue to judge her for that after the war, because they would bring those things up when they felt they needed to put her back in her place in later years. Yes, very. I don't, you know, I wonder, when you read memoirs from men written during the Second World War, they rarely reflect upon their children in the way that she does in her memoir. So it's just interesting.
I guess one of the things that I thought was really fantastic about her was her lack of fear. When it came to getting on these airplanes, which I know you know about. So could you talk a little bit about I think they're Lysanders, is that correct? And why they were so successful in the war, landing the way they did. I mean, because you don't go too much into that, and it is it's tense. Like, I think that's Lynn Olson's book does a good job of talking about that. But I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about it as well.
Yeah, so their biggest challenge as a resistance network was getting equipment in from MI6 and getting huge quantities of intelligence back to MI6. You know, you could only spend 20 minutes on the radio transmitting intelligence before the German detective vans could find where the radio was located. So you couldn't spend too much time transmitting. So you had to get your intelligence to move back and forth to London some other way. So they landed these planes from MI6, which were called Lysanders, in these fields in remote France. And it was this very well choreographed process, I guess you could say. So they chose the Lysanders because they could land in a very short strip. They didn't need a long landing strip like most aeroplanes would. They were very light, very agile aeroplanes. And they So they would mark out the shape of an L on these landing fields that they found, and you'd have three men at the landing field with a candle or a torch, some small light source. One would stand at the top of the L, one would stand at the heel, and one would stand at the toe. They'd hold up their light source at the appointed time when they could hear the buzz of the aeroplane. They would flash whatever Morse letter had been given to them as the code signal for that night. And then the plane would, when they saw the Morse letter flashing, they would flash their corresponding Morse letter. And then this plane would just deposit itself onto this L. It would taxi down the long part of the L and then park itself along the foot. And they had 2 minutes to get all of the equipment out of the plane. That might be crates of guns, it might be cigarettes to kind of pay the agents, it might be food supplies, it might be all kinds of different equipment. And then they'd have to get into the plane all the intelligence that needed to go back to MI6, plus usually people were going back and forth too. MI6 were sending in trained radio operators. Alliance Network was trying to evacuate any of their agents who were being seriously hunted by the Gestapo and needed to get out of France. So they had 2 minutes to do all of that. So Marie-Madeleine kind of describes it as being this quite beautiful process of watching these men with these candles and these torches on this field at midnight, and all there is the light of the moon. It's this very remote place. But then the plane lands and suddenly it's, sweating, anxious tension to get the plane off the ground, because if it stays on the ground for longer than 2 minutes, you're increasing the likelihood of it being discovered by the Gestapo and everybody being arrested. So she went back to London on one of those aeroplanes in 1943 to help the Allies with invasion planning. And, being a pilot herself, she loved that experience, and she loved chatting to the pilots in England who she met when she was staying in England for a short period of time. And so that whole process to her was, wonderful. And she described, coming in over the Tangmere airfield where she landed in England and seeing all those lights and how lit up it was, and coming from this kind of blackout place, it was quite incredible and quite extraordinary to her. And she remarks on things like the breakfast she was fed that morning, because it's like all this food. She's come from rationed France where you can't get any food at all, and suddenly there's eggs and bacon and this kind of treasure trove of things for her. So I love that she humanizes so many of the aspects of the experiences during the war, because she notices things like the food, which let's face it, if you were starving you would notice something like the food.
And she does have this premonition about pink heather, which I think is just so. Oh, it's you do such a good job of capturing.
Yeah. When I read about that, and that's one of the things that I think people will think I've made up, because again, things like premonitions, like most people don't believe in that kind of stuff, or dreams, but she really did. She had this very finely tuned gut, and it picked up on things that were about to happen. And she was haunted by this dream of pink heather in a field where a Lysander was going to land, and that a set of people was going to be arrested in this field of pink heather. And she tried to talk herself out of it. She, it was too womanly, too superstitious. It wasn't going to happen. It was just a dream. And then on driving to an airfield in London to send some agents back to France, she sees this field of pink heather, and it's like the pink heather from her dream. And what do? Do you say, oh, we can't do the plane flight because I've just seen pink heather? And she realizes how crazy that sounds, and that she can't say that to anyone because nobody is going to believe her. They're going to think she's gone mad. And that was probably one of the hardest moments of writing. It's like that decision to not speak up because you don't trust your gut, and then later to know that you should have trusted your gut, but also knowing that nobody would have listened to you because I dream about pink heather. Why would anyone pay heed to that? Traumatic moment to me reading about that in her memoir. I was like, oh gosh, if only. But of course, hindsight is, a lovely thing. Wouldn't we all love to know what was going to happen so we could change our decisions earlier?
So we have some wonderful comments that are coming in from the chat, and one person is joining us right now. They said they're coming in from South Korea and you're their favorite author. So although they did not put this question in the chat, I'm going to ask a question that I feel like is kind of for Jordan in South Korea, which is, I know we're almost out of time, but can you take a few minutes and tell us what's next for you? What are you working on?
Of course. So I'm just doing the kind of big editorial process for a book of mine, another novel that's coming out next year, in 2026, and it's called The Chateau on Sunset. And this one is a reimagining of Jane Eyre, set at Los Angeles' infamous Chateau Marmont during the 1950s and 1960s. So lots of fun to write. I love Jane Eyre, so I've had a great time playing around with giving Jane Eyre the story that I think she actually deserves.
You're muted.
I want to go on the record and say that this is the first time I've done that in probably 3 years, but I'm glad you're all here for it. Okay. So, let's see if I can remember my train of thought. Oh yeah. I wanted to kind of know how is it, and I understand that you would have finished this book, I'm guessing, the Mademoiselle Alliance 18 months ago or a year ago. So it's probably been a minute since you've been right in it. So how has the transition been, though, to go from this story to the one that you're working on now? Because they seem like this is I can just imagine the deep, deep, deep dive that this has taken.
Yeah. So luckily, you sort of work on books at different moments. So I've just been doing a lot of publicity and book tour events for the Mademoiselle Alliance. So I haven't been doing any writing at all, because I wouldn't have been able to write something like The Chateau on Sunset while talking about this book. But I'm really coming to the end of that publicity book tour phase now. So that's why I'm able to pick up the edits and start working on that other book. But I was working on writing that one last year, because the Mademoiselle Alliance was finished, basically. We were just doing sort of final proofreading. Yeah, you work so far ahead as a writer. Everyone's always constantly amazed that your 2026 book is already submitted to the publisher and going through this editorial process. But all of those things take a lot of time, to get covers, to talk to the booksellers about it. So you're always working a long way ahead, particularly when you have 3 kids who are prone to having to go to hospital for something every now and again, and you've suddenly lost a week of your writing life. So being organized pays off.
Well, Jordan has commented, and we feel the same way, that we are really looking forward to that. And we hope that we can hopefully see you again in 2026. And those of you who watch a lot recognize this tone of voice, because it does mean that, unfortunately, we are out of time. Natasha, it has been so awesome to have you with us. Like, we love the book and your energy, and the fact that you're joining us from so early in the morning over there in Australia. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's been so lovely to chat to all of you, and thanks everyone for watching.
Yeah, for those of you tuning in, we are so grateful for you spending your time with us too. You are why we do what you do, and we know we have viewers from all over the world watching this conversation, so thank you. The best way you can support Natasha Lester and the stories she tells and the histories that she is keeping going is to buy her books. So you can get the Mademoiselle Alliance from your favorite independent bookstore right now. You can also, if now isn't the time to buy for you, totally get it from your favorite library system. And if they don't have it, ask them to order it, ask them to get it in for you. We hope that you'll join us at more of our events. Next week, we have another virtual event for our Lunch and Learn Tuesday Lunch and Learn programs. It continues. We're having the editors of the collection Appalachian Reckoning, which is a response to J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. We hope you can join that. And then Tuesday night, we're in person at Mixed Food Hall in Mount Rainier for Solidarity Stories, Social Justice Book Group. We're talking about Art Spiegelman's Mouse. You can see more of our upcoming events by going to the Office of Human Rights webpage at civilrights.mypgc.us. And you can check out all of the many things the library has going on every single day by going to pgcmls.info/events. I also want to say we put Natasha's website up. We put it in the chat. We've also put it up on the screen, but I'm going to say it out loud for those of you who are listening. You can see Natasha on the web by going to Natasha Lester, all one word, .com.au. So please check out all that she has to offer as well. Again, thank you so much for joining us, Natasha. It has been absolutely wonderful. Good night, everyone. We hope we see you soon.